This video is looking at farming practices to increase productivity. We've already seen a video on productivity and food chains and food webs and how energy is transferred through the ecosystem. This is how farmers can try to maximise those energy efficiencies, trying to keep the efficiency as high as possible and the losses as low as possible. So as you saw with the energy transfers video, with a pyramid of energy, or pyramid of biomass, you've got very little left at the top. So humans often feed on the third or fourth trophic level. So most of the energy, if you can just answer that question first and pause the video. So if you remember, at each trophic level, all organisms carry out respiration, which is an exothermic reaction. It releases heat. So some of that heat is lost to the environment that is not available for the next trophic level, not available for the consumer of that organism to gain the energy from. If you've got animals, you've also got biological molecules lost in feces, which can't be eaten, or urine, which can't be eaten, and those biological molecules contain energy. If you could just quickly write down the equation for net primary production, and then pause the video just to test yourself on that. So just a reminder, this is the equation for net primary production. You saw this in the last video. And this is important to be able to understand when knowing how to increase plant productivity. So net primary production, that's the energy available for the next trophic level for the consumer, for the herbivore, and that's equal to GPP, which is the energy that's stored in the plant, biomass in a given area, volume in a given time, like kilojoules per metre squared per year. And that's the energy in the biological molecules produced after photosynthesis. But some of those are used up in respiration by the plant. So how can farmers increase NPP? It's quite different from when we look at animals, where you really just look at the equation mainly and use that to work it out. But with plants, it mixes together several different parts of the specification. So it's quite an intermingled answer, which makes it perhaps a little bit more tricky. So what can they do? We may have already looked at nutrient cycles and fertilisers. So they can have fertilisers, perhaps nitrates, so that the plant can absorb them through the roots, the inactive transport, and use those nitrates to make their own amino acids, their own proteins, their own DNA, because remember the nitrogenous base in DNA contains nitrogen, and it needs those things to be able to grow. Or it could contain phosphates. Phosphates, remember, needed for biological molecules such as DNA, got the phosphate group, phospholipids. So plants can't grow without an adequate supply of nitrates and phosphates, and often they're limiting in the soil. So by adding fertilisers, you're preventing those being a limiting factor. Thinking about your work on competition and also linking to energy, you could add pesticides. So pesticides could be weed killers. So that's preventing competition. So that preventing competition for light or space, so that you can increase the yield of your crop. It could be a pesticide to kill insects, which would eat the crop, and that links to food chains and food webs, because it's humans that want to eat the crop, not other insects or animals. So you could use pesticides as well. You could also use biological control, which we'll look at later in this. You could use a glasshouse or a greenhouse, and you could control certain conditions within that. For example, irrigation, plenty of water, or you could water a field if you're growing a crop in a field. Increasing the light intensity, increasing the temperature, preventing those being limiting factors. We've also got crop rotation, which we talked about. So crop rotation, the idea that different crops use different nutrients from the soil, different mineral ions from the soil, so allows you to use the same area for more years without having to add new fertiliser. Or it could reduce the number of pests. A lot of pests are species specific. So that reduce the population of pests in the field as well, so reducing crop damage, linking that to energy transfers, and might there be more energy that's available for the consumer, which in farming would be a human, or perhaps an animal which would eat the crop, which would then eat the animal. And one that I've not got a picture on here could be selective breeding, or genetically modification of crops to increase growth rate, increase the yield. So all of these things would increase the yield of a crop, perhaps increase the profits for a farmer. Okay, I'll ask you to pause the video in a second. Could you write down the equation for productivity in consumers? So hopefully you got that right. N being the net production of consumers, so that contains all the biological molecules in the new growth of that organism, and that's available for the next trophic level to consume. And the growth of the organism comes from the energy in the food that's been eaten, minus the energy lost in the biological molecules in the feces, and the energy lost in respiration as heat lost to the environment. So how can intensive farming increase the productivity in animals? Well, with this, if you look at the equation, it tends to make a bit more sense. So we want to try and reduce respiratory losses to the environment, and we want to try and reduce the feces loss to the environment. And that has a benefit because it will increase N if you reduce these two, or it could mean that you don't need to feed the animal as much to get the same amount of growth, which again would be more beneficial to the farmer in terms of costs. So we're trying to keep these as low as possible. How could they do that? Well, first of all, they could be fed on a controlled diet, so more of it could be absorbed, digested or assimilated, so less cellulose in the food, perhaps more protein, which can be more easily hydrolyzed. So that's reducing energy lost in feces. So there'll be fewer biological molecules lost containing energy in the feces. So reducing cellulose in the diet. It could also, to reduce respiration losses, restrict movement. If restricting movement, they're carrying out less muscle contraction. Muscle contraction requires ATP. ATP comes from respiration. So if there's less respiration, there'll be less heat lost to the environment. Less of those molecules, biological molecules that are eaten, will be used in respiration. Mammals and birds carry out respiration to maintain their own body temperature. So by keeping them in a warm environment or keeping them inside, they'll have to use less respiration to maintain their body temperature. So again, that is reducing the energy loss through respiration or heat loss to the environment. So using these two, that's 3 ways you can increase productivity. There are 2 others. If we look here at this growth curve, so this is a typical growth curve of a mammal, on most animals, and you can see it's slow to start off with, then you get a rapid rise in growth, and then still growing, but not at as fast a rate, and the animals stop growing their full size. You may think that that would be the time when they've reached full size, the animal, to slaughter them and sell for food. But actually, you'd wait until they got to about here, so just before the growth rate starts to slow down. Because as soon as that growth rate starts to slow down, the farmer's having to provide more food, but not getting as much gain in terms of growth of the organism. So slaughtered whilst they're still growing or before they're mature. And the last one, again, selective breeding. You can select, so it's a form of directional selection, if you think back to that from year 12. It's a form of directional selection, selecting the organisms to breed with which you think have got the alleles that provide either the quality of the meat or the growth or the size or the yield of milk, for example. So selecting those to breed, it's much more likely the offspring will have those alleles as well. So we're just going to do a little bit of a recap then. So many farming practices are designed to increase net productivity by increasing the efficiency of the energy transfer. And we looked at a number of ways that can happen. So we've looked at reducing respiratory losses, And also we've looked at simplifying food webs as well. So just as a little summary here, so this is ways that energy losses can be reduced in a human food chain, and other ways that we can reduce by simplifying food webs. So reducing energy losses and simplifying food webs. This says carefully controlled diet at the bottom if you can't read that. But you need to be able to explain why each of those will reduce the energy losses or increase efficiency of energy transfers. And if you need to go back to the previous explanations, then go back to them. The last thing we're going to look at is biological control. So instead of using pesticides, so that might be, well, in this case it's really sort of looking at insecticides. Instead of using insecticide to kill insect pests that consume the crop, which would mean that there's less available for humans, which would be the next trophic level, or if you're using it as a feed for animals, for them. So using animals to do that instead of pesticides. So a successful example, or natural example, is ladybirds, which would eat aphids, a natural predator of aphids. However, there are many situations where people have introduced a biological control, such as a cane toad, and it's not very successful. So you may wish to watch this video to see a not very successful example. If done correctly, biological control can be really a good way of maintaining or massively reducing pest numbers, but you do have to be very careful. You only want the organism you're introducing to be specific. You don't want it to overwhelm and outcompete or eat other native species. And the other thing, monoculture, so again with farming and with crops, so what are its advantages and disadvantages? So mono meaning one, so where you've got a field just full of wheat or just full of barley or something like that. So here are the advantages to a farmer with that. So again, it's easier to maintain and harvest, and you can have a uniform product, you can choose the characteristics, but there are disadvantages as well, and link it to the Year 12 topic of biodiversity. So there's less variety of plants, less insects, less birds, fewer natural predators of pests. There's also, if there's less biodiversity, there'll be fewer pollinators, and you might require pollinators to pollinate the crops, so you might not be able to get fruit produced, for example. So there are advantages of not having a monoculture.